Well, it's, as I'm sure you all know, my enormous honor and privilege to be here. Any invitation from Monroe is a privilege and a delight. And I know that you're a tremendous group. I'm looking forward to getting to know those of you whom I haven't yet met, and to having a spirited and undoubtedly very useful discussion. It's my experience that the Q&A is usually the best part. So I will speak as briefly as I can. I'm going to describe to you, really I'll do three things as briefly as I can, and then turn it over for your questions.
By the way, only one law student here, I think. Is that right?
You want to confess?
It's a very law-related talk in some ways.
In some ways, although I've been straying. You know, I'm a lawyer and I've taught in law schools, but at the moment I'm not teaching in a law school, and I'm not really working on law so much. But it's important to have lawyers and law students present to ask those questions and keep me honest. So in the talk, I'd like to do three things. One is to present to you a theory that that I've developed over the last 3 or 4 years that suggests a new way of thinking about inflammatory and offensive speech. You know, there's so often debate about where to draw the line between freedom of expression on the one hand and something that people call hate speech on the other, and I have an idea and a proposal, so I'll explain that. That is the dangerous speech part of the title. And then the second thing I'd like to do in the talk is discuss quickly some new methods of prevention. What I mean by prevention is preventing what I think are the effects of this dangerous speech. I don't necessarily want to prevent the speech, because I am a freedom of expression zealot for all kinds of reasons. So I think it's tremendously important to find ways of interfering with the effects of dangerous speech, which could, again, be different from suppressing the speech. And of course, I'll explain a little more what I mean about that. I have been very fortunate to take part in a few experiments in Kenya, particularly. And then the third thing I'd like to do in this talk is tell you what I'm cooking up now, and that is more experiments with a particular focus on new methods of prevention, of preventing really violence, since I think that dangerous speech is speech that has a special capacity to inspire or catalyze violence. And these new methods of prevention have to do especially with speech online. So that is the new direction I'm going in. I don't have slides on it because it's that new, and that's where I'm particularly anxious to have your critique, your comments, and your ideas. So with that, may I start? So I promised you this. The first section of the talk is this set of ideas about what I call dangerous speech. I think it's important to define this category, dangerous speech, for several reasons. One is that the term that is used in so many countries and normative contexts is hate speech. Hate speech is not very useful in my view, and can even be sort of small d dangerous. And I say that, I hope I'm not confusing you by using that term now tongue-in-cheek. The term hate speech is, let's say, ill-advised, in part because there's absolutely no consensus on what it means, either in law or in common parlance. It is almost always defined broadly and very often used by governments pretextually. In other words, to crack down disproportionately on their political opponents. I could give you innumerable examples of that. So in the vast majority of cases in which hate speech is used as a basis for speech regulation, it's either vaguely defined or over broadly defined, or both. And I believe in protecting freedom of expression vigorously, first of all, because I'm an international human rights lawyer, and freedom of expression is an exceptionally important human right, very important for protecting the other rights, for example, but also for a very specific instrumental reason related to dangerous speech. I think that if you restrict freedom of expression, you may in fact increase the chances of violence in the medium and long terms, because people have grievances, and if they haven't got a peaceful means to express those grievances and seek redress or correction, then that may increase the chances that they will resort to violence or condone violence. So I hope I've convinced you of that. There's yet another reason why I think it's important to define a category of speech that is more narrow than hate speech, and that is that any number, as I say, there are a number of different definitions of hate speech, but they are all large and various. In other words, they include lots of different types of speech, including speech that is offensive, frightening, terrifying, speech that is likely to catalyze violence, either because the audience will react violently or against the speaker, or because the audience will react violently or is more likely to react violently against someone else, against a third party. There's also lots of hate speech that has little or no chance of catalyzing violence. You can think of examples, I'm sure. If not, I'm happy to give you some. So that term is so broad as not to be useful, and I can't resist a final dig at it, which is that even the name hate speech, by choosing the word hate, focuses our attention on the state of mind of the speaker. Because hatred is presumably what the speaker has in his or her mind that is inspiring the speech. In some cases, hate speech may also generate hatred in the audiences, but in some cases, yes, in other cases, no. The consistent locus of hate must be the speaker, and that's, again, in law and also in common parlance, not terribly useful. For one thing, it's difficult to reliably ascertain the state of mind of anybody, including a speaker. And secondly, frankly, I'm not so interested in the state of mind of the speaker. As a human rights activist and also as a scholar, I'm much more interested in and worried about the effect of the speech on the audience than on the state of mind of the speaker. Does that make sense to you? The speaker might be, for example, mentally ill and therefore feeling certain emotions or certain convictions. That's very bad for the speaker, but it seems to me more important for the kind of work that I do to think about the audience. So at a conference a couple of weeks ago, someone said, wouldn't it be interesting to define a category called fear speech, which would be speech that is designed to generate fear in the audience? Not my idea, I'm afraid, but I think that's a very interesting idea. However, I propose instead dangerous speech, and I define it as speech. Sorry, did I push that? Speech that has this special capacity to inspire violence. That is to say, it inspires members of an audience either to condone or even to take part in violence. In the case of collective violence, which I'm particularly interested in, a very small number of members of a group actually commit the violence, but in the typical case, many more members of the society have also shifted their view so that they will condone violence.
So you don't use the word incite, you use the word inspire.
If I were talking about law, I might use the terms incitement or instigation. But I say inspire because I'm avoiding the term cause. There has been, particularly since the Rwandan genocide, a tendency to construe causation where there isn't really solid evidence for it. So you can say that the radio station RTLM in Rwanda, which was created by people who wanted to incite the Hutu population against Tutsis. And the radio station spilled out terrible speech designed to accomplish that purpose. Since the genocide, many people who, in my view, should know better, including judges at international criminal tribunals, have said that that radio station caused the genocide or caused the deaths of thousands of people in sentencing a defendant, convicting and sentencing a defendant in the so-called media case at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. One of the judges said, without a firearm or machete, you caused the deaths of thousands of people. But as I'm sure you all know, it's rather difficult to establish real evidence of causation between speech and violence for a number of reasons. One, there are many reasons why we carry out acts from brushing our teeth to massacring people. And of course, it's difficult to establish a causal line, a robust causal line between one speech act and an act of violence. So I say inspire or catalyze violence, because it seems to me that this dangerous speech has a greater capacity than the large inchoate category of hate speech to increase the chances that an audience will condone or take part in violence. So I'm trying to carefully define a space in between causation for which I don't have evidence and something so vague that it doesn't have meaning. Okay, so I've started work on this almost 4 years ago. By now, this thing is called the Dangerous Speech Project. And I have fundamentally these two goals: to define this category, if that makes sense and if it holds up under scrutiny. And then if there is indeed speech that is dangerous in the sense that it has a special capacity to inspire or catalyze violence, then I'd like to find ways of interfering with that process. That would be, frankly, quite terrific. People have been talking about preventing, for example, genocide for decades. There's now a lot of talk at the United Nations about the responsibility to protect, or R2P, and prevention is still mostly a question. The responsibility to protect so far has mostly meant sending UN troops. So if one could find something else that would work, that would be lovely. My research on many, many cases of collective violence and the months and years that preceded those outbreaks suggests that, well, first of all, it shows that there is very often an increasing surge of inflammatory speech preceding such episodes, preceding genocide and other forms of collective violence. And there are uncanny patterns that emerge from studying lots of this sort of speech, from case to case, across historical periods, across geographic regions of the world, and so forth. So I've begun to try to describe those. I'm now, in fact, beginning to collaborate with another scholar at Oxford whose work on ideology, on more robust and granular definition of ideology, overlaps quite a bit with mine, and he's done some wonderful work that I admire and am happy to feed on, if you like. So let me tell you quickly this this analytical framework that I've proposed to make a distinction. In other words, to to say this particular speech act, and of course a speech act need not be words, it can be a photograph, any form of expression, right? So I wanted some kind of tool that would allow an analyst to say, okay, this speech act, that's dangerous speech, this other one is not. To be able to draw a line. And my proposal is that there are 5 criteria with which one can reliably estimate the dangerousness of a particular speech act in the context in which it was made or disseminated. There's no point in trying to perform this analysis without looking at the context, because of course that is what determines what the philosophers of language call the force of a speech act. The force is its capacity to inspire reaction by people. So this is a kind of idealized version of a particularly dangerous speech act, and it embodies the 5 criteria, which are the speaker, the audience, the speech act itself, the social and historical context, and the means of dissemination. These will make, I think, quite a bit of intuitive sense to you. First of all, in most social contexts, the identity of the speaker makes an enormous difference in the force of a speech act. So I like to tell my students, for example, that I am a speaker who cannot commit incitement, particularly not to an extreme act like genocide, but I may not even be able to commit successful incitement to violence with any audience in the world, including them. Why? There's no audience that cares so passionately what I think. In other words, there is no audience that is so attached to me as a speaker or as a leader that I can, with my charisma and existing influence over that audience, successfully incite them to violence.
Are you arguing these are all necessary conditions?
No, they're not all necessary. Thanks, that's a very useful question, and I will clarify that just in just a second. So the speaker is very important. Also, of course, the audience is important. I'm happy to be able to tell you that I think my students are also an audience that is not particularly susceptible to incitement. And as you can imagine, some audiences are much more susceptible for all kinds of reasons. They are already fearful, they are hungry, they are afraid, there are various types of fear, afraid for their children, concerned about resource competition, et cetera, et cetera. The third criterion is the speech act itself, and I'm suggesting that it be understood as a call to violence by the audience most likely to react. A given speech act can, of course, be understood very differently by different audiences. For the purpose of this analysis, one can simplify and clarify by asking only, how was the speech act understood by the audience most likely to react? This would have saved the International Criminal Tribunals dozens, if not hundreds, of hours of debate as they argued over the meaning of speech acts in various different contexts. It seems to me that is not so useful. And then the fourth criterion, social and historical context, that's quite a kitchen sink. In other words, it can include many different sorts of factors. It is, of course, critical. Just to give you an example there, if in a given sociocultural context there were previous episodes of violence followed by inflammatory speech, that makes the next inflammatory speech much more dangerous. Why? Because speaker and audience all know that it's not just a joke, that in previous cases inflammatory speech has been followed by violence. This was the case, for example, in Rwanda in 1994. There were terrible massacres in 1992 in Rwanda, notably followed by inflammatory speech. So you can understand that gives the subsequent speech a greater power, because potential perpetrators and victims all know that this has happened before. And then finally, influential means of dissemination. I'm just giving you some examples in each case, for each of these criteria. Means of dissemination could be a technical means, like a radio station or a particular platform in social media. If a population is depending for much of its news on one radio station, for example, then the fact that a message was disseminated over those airwaves can itself give the message greater force. Does that make sense? And then a means of dissemination may also be the language. When I was conducting field research in Kenya, there were a few remarks that were made over and over spontaneously by completely different interview subjects. And one of them was this: if I hear a message in English or Kiswahili, those are both national languages in Kenya, I hear it with my head. But if I hear it in my mother tongue, that's the way that Kenyans refer to their ethnic or tribal language or vernacular language, then, they all said to me, I hear it differently, I hear it with my heart. So the message has a different kind of force, a different effect on the person, according to the Kenyans I talked with. And there are other further explanations I could give for each of these five. Monroe asked if all five are required. They are absolutely not. There are some circumstances in which a speaker is so powerful that other factors become less important, or in fact, other criteria on the list are not weighing heavily. But, for example, 1 and 3 weigh so heavily that the speech act can be dangerous, even though, for example, the means of dissemination is not particularly influential. You can imagine that there are some messages that are so powerful in certain circumstances that the means of dissemination need not itself be influential for the speech to be dangerous. You can't go without at least 2 criteria weighing, however. So now just, I've already done a bit of this, but just a little bit of explanation of each of these criteria. You can imagine that a speaker might have greater influence over an audience for any number of reasons. And the source of a speaker's influence need not be a political office. Phil Schrag has argued with me about this, but I think that in many cases, a religious leader or even a cultural leader, a pop star like Simon Bikindi in Rwanda, may have greater influence over an audience than a political figure. I can think of figures in the United States, for example, who might well have greater influence over numerous audiences than President Obama. And then you see that the audience need not only be susceptible to incitement, but must also, for the speech really to be dangerous, the audience must have the means or capacity to commit violence. If not, then the speech can't be dangerous. As I say, the speech should be understood by the audience most likely to react as a call to violence. I also mentioned to you that there are striking patterns across cases, and I've, from the unhappy experience of studying so many of these examples, I've identified a few of these patterns. One of them is very famous already. It's dehumanization. It is extraordinarily common for let's call them violent speech entrepreneurs, to address their own group and to describe another group of people as some creature that is not human. Vermin, pests, animals. I can say the terms rats and cockroaches in an extraordinary number of languages because those seem to be the 2 most common creatures used to dehumanize another group of people. Perhaps they're also the creatures most widely despised in human cultures. So dehumanization has, of course, also been described by many other scholars, and it makes sense. It makes it seem acceptable to do things that you wouldn't do to other human beings if you still conceived of those people as human beings. If you can view another person as a rat or a cockroach, then it becomes easier to commit or condone violence and atrocities being committed against that person. I've identified here one other telltale sign or hallmark of dangerous speech, which was nicknamed by a Hutu propagandist before the Rwanda genocide, accusation in a mirror. In my view, this takes the audience beyond the collective psychological step of seeing atrocities as acceptable. If you were a really great violent speech entrepreneur and you had gotten the audience to see atrocities as acceptable, but you wanted to go further, what would be even better from your point of view? To get the audience to see atrocities as what? Not just acceptable, but necessary, exactly. If you could get the audience to go beyond and see them as necessary, then you'd be there. Why? I have one law student who may be able to tell me which is the one ironclad defense to homicide in every legal system. Self-defense. So if you can convince an audience that mass violence is necessary, then you can get them to see whatever is going to be done to the other group as defensive. And then that's the collective analog of self-defense. So you've done extraordinary collective psychological work. And the way that it is done, this thing keeps moving, although I'm not touching it. I'm sorry about that. That's quite, that must be very
movie right along.
disorienting for you. All right, I'll take the hint. All right, so accusation in a mirror is when I, as an inciting speaker, tell my group that the other group is planning to annihilate them. This was one of the principal features of Hitler's famous speech in January 1939. The international Jewish conspiracy is planning to wipe out the German folk. It's quite extraordinary when you think about it, that he was successful in persuading quite a few Germans of that, given the fact that there was not even any organized Jewish fighting force. They didn't have weapons, etc. But that was an absolutely essential plank of Nazi propaganda. It was also an essential plank of Hutu propaganda. It arises in case after case after case. Accusation in a mirror. You tell your group that the others are planning to attack them. And then there are other hallmarks, but in the interest of keeping up with the slides, I'll go on and welcome your questions if you're curious about more of those. So this is just an example. Rat d'égout means sewer rats. And then I've mentioned recent outbreaks of violence following other speech acts. And there are numerous risk factors for mass violence that have been described by other scholars. This is just another example of dangerous speech. This guy has now died, and his funeral unfortunately gave rise to other troubling inflammatory speech and state repression of speech that was not inflammatory in any case. And then means of dissemination. So now I'd like to talk to you a bit about part two, some of the experiments, some of the means of prevention that have already been tested. Umati is, we believe, the first, in fact, we know, the world's first attempt to systematically comb the online spaces in a country for hate speech and dangerous speech. Groups of young Kenyans sat in front of terminals for 8 hours a day, reading Facebook, Twitter, blogs, newspaper comment sites, any number of online sources, searching for inflammatory speech, hate speech, dangerous speech, incitement, the whole ball of wax, and then using a coding sheet that was based on the dangerous speech guidelines that I've just shown you to sort each example they found into one of three categories. Offensive, sometimes we call it merely offensive, which is a bit of a sad, ironic term, but merely offensive, moderately dangerous, and very dangerous. So they looked at the 5 factors that you saw and performed this analysis, even as they were collecting. It seems to me very much more useful to monitor and analyze at the same time, rather than simply to blindly collect databases of speech. This also allowed them to refer particularly dangerous cases of speech to another system called Uchaguzi that was operated by the nonprofit tech firm Ushahidi, with which some of you may be familiar. This is a crowdsourcing information gathering platform used in crises in many different countries around the world. So the very dangerous speech was fed into Uchaguzi, and Uchaguzi was then able to pass it on to first responders to try to prevent violence. So as you can see, first of all, Umati tested the methodology. The idea was to set up a system that could be used in other countries. The electoral context refers to the fact that Kenya had elections in March of this year, on March 4th. They were presidential and parliamentary elections, and voted for some other new county officials around the country. These were major elections that would have been a big undertaking under any circumstances, but were particularly important and worrisome because the last time Kenya had had nationwide presidential parliamentary elections was the end of 2007. Just as this time the vote was hotly contested, it divided the country along ethnic or tribal lines. And in 2007, the result was contested, and then after months of increasing divisive inflammatory speech, terrible violence erupted, and more than 1,000 people were massacred, and 500,000 were displaced from their homes, most of whom still haven't been able to go back. So even as Kenya was preparing for this election in 2013, this year, there was very widespread concern among Kenyans and people who care about Kenya that the same thing might happen again. So it seemed important to monitor this inflammatory speech this time. In 2007 and 2008, by the way, quite a lot of the speech was disseminated by SMS and also by email, as well as, of course, by more traditional methods. So it looked interesting and useful to study speech online. Of course, it is also much easier to collect speech systematically online. And it may be easier to practice methods to diminish the impact of such speech online, because obviously you can distribute speech quite effectively online, and you can study its effects much more effectively online than offline.
Is this an argument for surveillance?
No, it's not. Although it is tricky to figure out the line between surveillance and monitoring. For example, which Facebook pages did we look at, and how did we get to them, is a question I would invite you to ask.
You're asking about you're doing it, but as opposed to if you wanted to do it systematically in Kenya, I mean, if you wanted to scale it up, would you scale it up, or would you use this as a method to identify the speech, not identify the speakers, or identify the scale? In other words, one notion is that this monitoring exercise is to do the first step, identify particular speech acts. Mm-hmm. So you don't need to monitor everybody, et cetera, et cetera.
We tried, but yeah. You could, as you say, you could start by trying to get a decent sample of it. And if nothing else, you'd have an interesting database to study. Is that what you're thinking?
I'm not sure what I'm thinking, but yeah, go ahead.
Along the
Yeah.
lines of that, what do you think of like crowdsourcing these kind of things? Like, there's a thumbs up, thumbs down up feature on a lot of different social media sites like Reddit,
Yes.
even YouTube.
The problem with thumbs up, thumbs down is it reminds me of what somebody at Facebook told me was the entire content of their instructions that they gave to their own internal speech regulators at the beginning of Facebook. You know that from the beginning there have been people at Facebook, as at the other companies, who deleted stuff, who took down content from those platforms. In the beginning, those regulators at Facebook were told, if it makes you feel uncomfortable, take it down. That was the whole rule book. And of course, that leads to extremely subjective, inconsistent regulation. And on Reddit, thumbs up, thumbs down tells you only that each individual person who responds, for some reason, which could be any number of reasons, dependent on each person's.
Although I think it's designed to be the wisdom of the crowd, so it's the integration of each. In other words, we may have a lot of people having different opinions, but you're trying to crowdsource the kind of sense of the community.
Right, but you don't know why the community has effectively censored or voted against a particular piece of speech.
Right.
If it just says
Well, that's
thumbs
why
up,
it's the
thumbs
wisdom of
down,
the crowd. I mean,
well,
I'm not saying that.
Thumbs up on something incredibly
Like,
hateful
I'm
and
moving to
violent.
California, thumbs down.
Or
Having
all
hate
the
speech.
how do you get all the Tutsis to, they can presumably vote thumbs up on
Yeah,
any
that's
number
true.
of dangerous speech items.
and the
that's the
crowd
wisdom of
might
the
be
crowd.
mixed, Hutu and Tutsi, and so
Right.
all the Tutsi vote thumbs up and all the Hutus vote thumbs down, but if it's aggregated, then all you know now is,
Yeah.
you know. So it's an extremely inchoate and vague way of collecting information or of inviting a group of people to vote. If you could manage to educate a group of people so that some proportion of them share a particular criterion with which you now ask them to react, then crowdsourcing might be more useful as an inherent form of speech regulation. And that's sort of where I'm going. So unless you'd like to ask a follow-up question, I'll try to get there.
Well, actually, yes, sorry.
Please.
The wisdom of the crowd is not always a useful mechanism because a lot of these mechanisms themselves, for instance, Twitter, have inherently mechanisms that can steer towards a certain wisdom or a certain thumbs up or thumbs down. So, and that's part of the mechanism you cannot explain. I mean, or
Right.
Twitter perhaps can explain, but you cannot explain it by, for instance, a concerted effort by the crowd to achieve a certain, audience effect.
That's right. Particularly because there is almost never such a thing as the crowd.
Right.
There are various different crowds that interact in complex ways, which can be studied and should be studied more, but especially on a very open platform like Twitter, if you invite people to react, to respond to, if you try to crowdsource, you don't know who you're getting really, right? So that's tempting, but would need, I think, more thought and development. So just to tell you a bit more about Umati, it began in September of 2012, so as to get something of a head start in the months leading up to the election. As those months passed, as I'll show you in a second on another slide, I keep turning around to see if it's already there. Hate speech and inflammatory speech and dangerous speech increased quite steadily and became not only more prevalent but more virulent. And frankly, after a while, in late January, we became alarmed. I say we, I served as an advisor on this project, but it was carried out by iHub Research, which is the research arm of Ushahidi, of this tech organization in Kenya that has pioneered some very useful and interesting crowdsourcing software. So we cooked up another project quickly called Nipe Ukweli. We said this can no longer be only a research effort, we've got to do something. Nipe Ukweli means, loosely translated from Swahili, give me truth, or give me truth. And that name reflects the fact that dangerous speech is very often false. One more common characteristic of it. And that a subset of dangerous speech, so dangerous speech is a subset of hate speech, now a subset of dangerous speech is false rumors. Those, especially in an inflammatory, volatile situation like the pre-electoral moment in Kenya, can be especially powerful and dangerous. So we wanted to try to encourage Kenyans to resist false rumors and even to refute them when they could. So we held up examples of people who had done that. There was a guy, for example, in Mombasa, the largest coastal city in Kenya, who had refuted a rumor that Muslims were wholesale burning churches in Mombasa. So he tweeted a photograph of a church that was intact, together with the words, "Stop the lying, a normative appeal," and direct refutation of a rumor. So as you see, an outreach campaign to encourage citizens to resist and speak out against dangerous speech online and in person. Nipe Ukweli was an online effort and also an offline effort. And also its messages were disseminated on radio stations. Now, Vioja Mahakamani is another effort at diminishing the impact of dangerous speech by working with the audience. I would like to make another broad and strong claim to you, and that is that for almost all of human history, there have been basically two methods only of reacting to objectionable speech. Generally, it was the state reacting, but let's just say the authorities, across cultures and historical periods, have had essentially just two ways of reacting to objectionable speech. One is to go after the speaker with punishment of various kinds. And the second is to go after the speech itself with censorship. That was pretty much the toolbox. So I've got the nutty idea that we must come up with alternatives, in part because, of course, again, as a human rights person, I don't approve of punishing speakers for speaking in most cases, or of censoring speech in most cases. But perhaps even more importantly, neither of those two methods works terribly well, especially online. So just to give you an example, the United States killed Anwar al-Awlaki, a notable and apparently very influential speaker, with a drone in Yemen. And many months later, he inspired the Boston bombers and continues to inspire people today, even though he's now very dead. So what else could one do other than going after the audience and going after the speech? You could try, other than going after the speaker, I blew the punchline. Going after the speech, you could try to work with the audience and make people less susceptible to dangerous speech. That is what we tried to do with Nipe Ukweli, and also with 4 episodes of a very popular Kenyan television program called Vioja Mahakamani, which means events in the courtroom, essentially. This show is one of the longest running television shows in the world. It has been on the air in Kenya since 1974. It's a show on KBC, on the public broadcasting network. And it's got a sort of socially conscious mandate, which is to say that each episode, although they're all humorous, the show is a comedy, each episode also tries to put across some kind of message. For example, when you ride your motorcycle, you really ought to wear a helmet. That's just one that springs to mind. Messages against domestic violence and so forth. They've covered lots and lots of different issues over their 40-year history. And this last year they had 4 episodes on dangerous speech, designed to try to help Kenyan audiences to become less susceptible to that sort of speech. I'm very grateful that CGCS, most specifically Lauren Kogan, conducted an independent evaluation of the impact of those shows, which gives us a little bit of, I think, a basis for guarded optimism. Lauren showed our 4 episodes to one audience, and then showed 4 other episodes of Vioja Mahakamani that had nothing to do with dangerous speech to another control group. And it seems that the audience or she found with her colleagues, that the audience that watched our 4 episodes was a bit more skeptical of incitement than the control group. Unfortunately, we weren't, or they were not able to show that the audience was, the audience that had watched the episodes was more likely, in fact, to take non-violent responses to inflammatory speech once presented with an actual situation. But perhaps that would have been awfully ambitious for only 4 episodes of a TV program. And there have been other, very few, but other interesting efforts to use media programming to try to shift attitudes in response to inflammatory speech. In our field of human rights, we've done practically nothing compared to other fields like public health, which have decades of experience trying to change human attitudes and behavior using media programming, as you know. This is just a flyer or poster that was produced as part of the Nipi Ukweli project. It defines dangerous speech, and it encourages people to, as I said, to resist and refute it. And then just, I'm almost finished now with the slides. I'm just going to show you a few on Nipi Ukweli, Umati. So this just shows that, unfortunately, dangerous speech increased systematically and dramatically in the months leading up to the election. A second finding that we were quite struck by is that even the most irate and inflammatory commenters made minimal efforts to remain anonymous. We were surprised. They sometimes use pseudonyms, but that's about as far as they went to try to hide their identities. And as you know, and as they probably knew, using a pseudonym is not at all a robust way of hiding yourself. This was especially surprising given the fact that since the 2007 and 2008 disaster in Kenya, a new government agency was founded and made statutory. It's called the National Cohesion and Integration Commission, and a big part of its job is to monitor hate speech and refer people for prosecution. And then maybe the single most interesting finding from my perspective is that of all the more than 5,000 discrete examples of dangerous speech found by the monitors, more than 83% were on Facebook alone. Yeah. We expected to find lots on Facebook, but not that much. And then, can you even see this? These minuscule little, you can't even call them lines, really? That's Twitter. That's Twitter. This graph compares Facebook and Twitter. So we expected a disproportion. There are a number of reasons why you would expect a disproportion. Twitter is much more public. There's some expectation of privacy on Facebook, usually exaggerated, but nonetheless reasonable. In part because of that, Kenyans are more likely to communicate in English or Kiswahili on Twitter, and a bit more likely to use a tribal or vernacular language on Facebook.
Where do people usually access the internet in Kenya? Because I mean, I can see this, the Facebook being, you know, a lot more user-friendly for people who are in internet cafes and things like that. You sit down to like be on Facebook, and Twitter is kind of a mobile kind of firing things off.
So
And if
it's
you're not
an
on
excellent question.
your iPhone all the time, then
Yeah, well, it depends on who you're talking about. Kenyans are adopting mobile telephony at a staggering rate, including, by the way, poor Kenyans. iHub Research did an excellent report last year showing that the rate of adoption of phones is huge, and there are phones called feature phones that are somewhere in between our old-fashioned phones and smartphones. So it's a relatively inexpensive Chinese phone on which you can get typically a 2G network, so it's quite slow, but there are apps for both Twitter and Facebook. So those are still slow. That's coming quickly, but was not so much a factor in this data or these data. I would say that, well, truth is I don't know how many people would have been using laptops and how many people were posting using their phones. I don't think that would have explained the disproportion, though, because you can there are apps for both Twitter and Facebook on phones. So anybody who has got a phone and has got the apps and is on either Twitter or Facebook would easily be able to be on the other one as well. So we wanted to find out why there was this enormous disproportion. And one experiment that I'm going to very quickly tell you this what I promised, third part of the talk, what's up now. I've made a big collection of anti-hatred efforts online. There are quite a few of them. Most of them are just done spontaneously by users. Some are humorous, some are not humorous and passionate, huge variety. What there isn't, as far as I can tell, is one single experiment to test their effectiveness. Has any one of these anti-hatred efforts changed anybody's mind? I don't know about you, but I'm amazed at that. What a gigantic opportunity it is, since it's not very difficult to study that. So, partially with this data, I've got Twitter and the Umati team working together to look at these very tiny numbers. It's about 100 examples of dangerous speech that were on Twitter in this relevant period. What we are trying to collect is those examples of dangerous speech and then all the tweets that reacted to them. Because we already have found some cases in which the original speaker recanted. And then we've begun looking at other examples of surges of inflammatory speech. For example, following the choosing of the latest Miss America, whose parents are from India. So I'm sorry to say there were many Americans who tweeted, why is she Arab? Why is she Al-Qaeda? Et cetera, et cetera. Or somebody from Twitter said, why is she Arab? Person said, I know that the person who posted this is pronouncing it that way. So we wanted to know, and then there was lots of what we might call counter speech. Other Twitter users reacting and saying, you're wrong, you're racist, don't say that. And it seems to me an essential question is, did any of that second group of speech change the minds or at least the speech patterns of the first group? And we've already got a bit of anecdotal evidence that in some cases it did. That some of those hateful speakers changed. For example, one of them tweeted Miss America to apologize. Now the question, it seems to me, is how often does that happen? And if so, in which circumstances? Could we come up with a field guide to counter speech, something like the one that I've constructed for dangerous speech? In other words, which counter speech is effective in what circumstances? What characteristics has it got? Are there hallmarks or telltale signs of counter speech that reflect its effectiveness. And I am in the process of putting together two kinds of experiments on this. Number one is to go and look at the data that's already out there, as I've just described to you. To find, for example, an inflammatory or hateful or dangerous tweet, and then look at all of the tweets that mentioned that one, that reacted to it. That's looking at existing data. And then a second possible experiment would be, a second study would be an experiment in which one might identify, for example, 100 people online or Twitter users who are generating hateful or dangerous speech, and then produce counter speech of 4 or 5 different types that I hope social psychologists and perhaps some of you and others will help us to design. And then, of course, we'd have a control group and compare what happens in response to various forms of counter speech. So with that, I'll stop and invite your questions. I'm sorry I've gone longer than I hoped.
Lauren, I'm going to see if there are cookies out there and bring them
I'll grab it.
in. Okay.
You had a question?
I had a question, clarification for this graph.
Yes.
It's the month of your studies. This is the
Months.
period of your study.
Yes, exactly. It's October, November, December, and so forth.
I
So
see.
March was the election.
Right. And there was a very low level of dangerous speech, right?
Well, on Twitter, a very low level throughout. I'm
Right.
gonna snap
I'm
one.
talking about the left side of the.
Left side is
that would be
Facebook.
Facebook, yeah, that's what I'm talking. Facebook.
Yeah,
So that in the first month there was a very low level.
exactly.
Like now, what I'm just wondering, and again, I it's I'm kind of short.
Me too.
Is when I see the end of this, the final month of your speech, the hate speech on Facebook increased enormously compared to the first month.
True.
It hit me, and I was just wondering, and this is just a question, no offense meant, right?
No offense taken.
Was it a reaction to your research?
Wow, I wish I could take offense.
No, I'm asking. I have.
No, it's a
yeah,
wonderful
yeah.
question because it presumes that our research had much more impact than it did, I think.
Word of mouth or just.
Just candidly, I don't think so because I don't think we were important enough.
Okay.
We were very gratified when the word started to get around
Right.
about Umati and also about Nipu Kweli, because of course with Nipu Kweli we were hoping to have publicity and impact. But I would be amazed, in particular because, frankly, the sort of like-minded, tolerant Kenyans online were the ones who were more likely to be familiar with us and sympathetic to our project. There you're looking at the most inflammatory speech. And so I wish that I could say that I thought we had an impact on those people, but I doubt it.
I was just wondering about,
Lee?
Yeah, of course, I'm only guessing.
Yeah,
You know,
Lee?
I don't know that for sure.
Lee?
I guess I should. That's, by the way, just because it's funny that at first the slides were going faster than me and now they're going slower than I am, more slowly. This is the cast of Vioja Mahakamani, and the lady that you see there, who is largest, is the judge. She has played the figure of the judge since she's been an actress on the show since 1978 and has been playing the judge for more than 30 years. Her name is Lucy Wangui. She's a magnificent person, and herself has a great deal of influence. I had the privilege of traveling around Kenya in a white van with those actors, filming the 5-minute setup scenes that begin each one of the episodes. They said, Professor, we have decided that we have to go to the hotspots. Hotspots are places where violence was bad in 2007 and 2008. And so they felt that our episodes would have greater power, greater force, for good, of course, to influence people if Kenyans could see that the show was actually filmed in the places where these terrible things happened. And so, of course, I said, oh, we don't have the budget for that. You know, can't you film it in Nairobi and make it look like Eldoret? And they said, no. Kenyans know what Nairobi looks like, and they know what Eldoret looks like. We've got to go to Eldoret. So we went. Every time that van even slowed down, never mind, stopped, crowds would gather because Kenyans recognize the actors. And they have particular fondness for Lucy, who even recounted to me that once she was visiting relatives, and her relative had some business to do in a court. So, as a family member and to be supportive, Mheshimiwa, as she was also known universally in Kenya, Mheshimiwa means your honor. And so on the show, she is always referred to as Mheshimiwa, your honor. So she went along to the real courtroom with her relative, and apparently the judge looked over the bench out at the audience and said, Mheshimiwa, is it you? And she said, yes, that's me, you know. And so the actual judge said, you come up here and you sit down with me and we'll decide the case together. So it was quite an extraordinary case of, you know, fiction becoming reality, but also an indication of the sort of influence that can, I think, arise from a cultural figure's long-standing place in society
Have more questions.
and in the culture. Go ahead,
Okay, I have sort of two interrelated questions.
please.
First, it seems to me that the criteria for dangerous speech apply to speech acts that influence violence positively. That is to say that the speaker is giving recommendations that are followed up through violence, as compared to like a negative response to a speech act whereby someone says something that people react against violently. Is that?
I'm not sure I understand. Can you say it again?
So like the criteria about the powerful speaker, the venue, all of these sorts of things mostly relate to a situation where a speaker will profess hatred for someone and recommend a violent act. And I didn't see, I'm wondering how they apply to situations wherein someone will post, say, something that's often conceived as blasphemy is probably the most common example of these things, then get filtered through the channels that you described that I think are very clear cut, where someone will pick up on this and say, look at this terrible thing, we need to react against that or whatever. But I'm wondering if it applies also to the other side, to the thing that is perceived as being blasphemous. So, and then my follow-up question to that is the dangerousness in the speech itself, or does part of it have to do with the reaction? So, for example, Rush Limbaugh professes hatred for women all the time. Does it become dangerous if we start throwing rocks at him, or is it just hate speech until that point? Those are the kind of distinctions I'm looking to get at. Was that clear?
Yes, I think so. So in the first case, you're thinking about something like the innocence of Muslims,
Something like that.
or the burning of the Quran by
Sure.
Terry Jones.
These types of things that are interpreted by people in other places, perhaps, as being hateful, and then that inspires violence.
So that's why I say that you can't consider the dangerousness of a speech act without looking at the context. So when The Innocence of Muslims was produced in California, had it been shown to, you know, an audience of, I don't know, actors or extras in Hollywood, it would not have been dangerous speech, because that audience wasn't likely to react with violence to it. It was only when that speech was taken to another normative context, and by the way, publicized by another speaker. There was a TV presenter on Al Nas Egyptian TV who spoke about the video. Now, in that context, it was dangerous.
So was
Who's the dangerous speaker?
Which part is the dangerous? Is it the person who's taking it and then reciting it, or does that make the original, The Innocence of Muslims or whatever, does that make it violent speech?
It's an excellent question. So this is what I call a transnational dangerous speech episode, because the speech has crossed a national and or cultural boundary, a boundary between normative groups. And the way I think about it is, it's like carrying two batteries in your pocket. They become, you get fire when the wrong poles connect. So you need both speakers in this case. You need Terry Jones, who says he's going to burn the Quran. And frankly, I think he is, if not legally, at least morally culpable, because he knew if he did that it was likely that the other battery, in that case Hamid Karzai, decided to speak about that on national television in Afghanistan. And then a third battery, the local mullahs in Mazar Sharif, spoke about it and accompanied a crowd to go and attack the local UN mission there, and 12 totally innocent people were killed. So it's the connection between inflammatory speakers in the sending country, if you like, and at least one other one in the receiving country that causes the disaster. There is a difference, though, between cases in which the second speech is foreseeable and cases in which it isn't. Terry Jones, for example, threatened to burn the Quran, if you may remember. He was beseeched not to do so by no less than cabinet officers of the U.S. federal government. So he didn't, but then 5 months later he came again and did it. Not surprisingly, people were killed because, as I said, other inflammatory speakers took that message. It has been often pointed out that even had no one produced The Innocence of Muslims, or even had nobody burned the Quran in Florida, it would have been possible for the speakers at the other end to just have said so, to have invented it. But in those cases, they didn't. There was an original speech act on which they based their incitement. So,
what about the mass media intermediating between those two acts, because they were constantly, constantly over the entire.
That's right, and that's why
it turned it into a global speech act.
major American media outlets chose not to cover Terry Jones when he did burn the Quran, precisely because of that. The BBC chose not to cover that story, precisely because of it, because they saw it coming and they knew that it could have terrible consequences. But in this day and age, it's not enough. In other words, that didn't successfully suppress the story.
So can you hold them accountable by means of your 5 points, for instance? By
Hold whom accountable?
The mass media in this case, as intermediaries between the two speech acts?
No, I
Because
don't
they
think
can
so.
become part of the act and reinforcing that dangerous speech?
I don't think you can say that they reinforced it. They disseminated
You are right.
a speech act. And it would be difficult to hold, the mass media accountable. It's like saying the crowd. There are so many different media outlets, and in particular these days, even if the mainstream media completely suppressed a story, it would still come out.
Well, I
And
say
then-
two things. One thing that I find interesting about your approach is it's not about holding people accountable.
That's
And
also
so
absolutely.
All the questions are about, including.
About punishing the speakers.
So this is a different framework for thinking about it. It's not about who should be held accountable, but what should be responded to in what way. And then the other thing on that.
Thank you, I should have said that.
Pardon?
Thank you.
But I think there's a way in which there's no way to respond so that it's completely obliterated or modified. All you can do is hope to modify it to some extent.
That's right.
You're not suggesting that your intervention in Kenya would eliminate all potential violence. If you could
Absolutely
reduce it,
not.
it would be great. So that may be true for the stories that didn't run, or a whole variety of things. In other words, they can't completely achieve the objective. Or Obama.
But do you know
saying-
what? Punishing people doesn't
No, I
completely achieve
understand.
the objective. Generally doesn't achieve the
Yeah.
objective at all.
Right.
And in fact, in defense of these unconventional sounding methods, like trying to, I call it, inoculate the audience against inflammatory speech, You know, informal speech regulation can be exceptionally powerful. We rely on it greatly in the United States, although that isn't very much publicized. An example that I like to use with my students is to ask them how likely it is in 2013 that an American politician would use the N-word in public. Anybody?
0.2.
She did that in December.
Thank you. It usually takes the students a lot longer to get to exactly that figure. You know, there's sort of debate. Well, is it like 1%? No, it's, 0.0 at something. Yeah, it's extremely, extremely unlikely, right? And 40 years ago, which is this in human history, how likely would it have been 50 years ago?
60s.
Lauren,
Let's
you
say
had a
the
question?
50. Very likely. Let me just finish this example, then I promise. So there's been I want to make 2 points. One is there's been an enormous shift in a relatively short period of time. It's nowhere near far enough, in my view, but popular speech regulation, informal collective speech regulation, has changed very dramatically in the United States. Another example would be gay marriage. Very dramatically. So that at this point, we have an extremely powerful, effective, informal norm against saying the N-word in public in the United States. You can debate whether you think that that's the right norm, but I think you'd have to grant me that it is a very effective norm. And then I would say, okay, what's a really bad thing? And my students will say, murder or rape. Okay, so how do we regulate that? We have law. And does that work very well? Sort of. So I would like to at least try to convince you of this point, that informal speech regulation, effectively carried out by crowds, can be tremendously powerful and also can change quite fast.
I'm still curious as to whether or not the violence is in the speech or the response to the speech in a certain sense. So, like, you can imagine something that would fall under your classification and not cause anything. So, I mean, I like the Rush Limbaugh example because he satisfies a lot of the criteria in terms of being influential,
Yep.
having access to authoritative media channels and these types of things. But he doesn't speak to a public that we would generally consider to be vulnerable to violent up
Generally
or
not.
whatever.
Right.
But we can also imagine a situation where we might get fed up enough with him saying horrible things about women or minorities or whatever, and we start reacting. Does that become violent speech after that? Was it violent speech before, dangerous speech before?
Once there is an appreciable chance that the audience will react with violence, that the section of the audience most likely to react will react with collective violence, now the speech is dangerous. Before the violence.
Upon Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah, which is like a reversal of
No, but
Yeah.
also the
normal-
question, is speech as such violence?
Pardon me?
Speech as such, like the speech act, is it violence done to people?
So
without
that's
like, physical.
an excellent question, and I'm often asked that. How do you define violence and how do you define harm? We would need another hour for that one. For the moment, I have distinguished physical violence from other forms of harm. But I certainly grant you that speech can cause, I would, in part because I'm a lawyer, call it harm or damage rather than actual violence. I follow the law in defining violence as physical harm to a person. And as you know, in the United States, our law, our First Amendment law, abhors regulation based on harms other than physical violence. But there is some interesting writing now in the last couple of years. For example, Jeremy Waldron has written an interesting book on hate speech, arguing that the harm that it visits on members of society can in turn harm democracy without any mention of violence. So I'm, of course, very well familiar with those arguments and worrying about them. But I came to this whole topic from from genocide prevention and from thinking about societies that are at real risk of mass violence. And I'm now, because of increasing interest in speech online, beginning to think about inflammatory speech in all kinds of other circumstances, including individual acts of violence. Of course, I can't be American and thinking about speech online without thinking of cyberbullying and all of these other circumstances and acts which are very different and take place in very different circumstances. So maybe I must come up with another framework that incorporates more of these situations.
If you come up with another framework or you expand this framework, would you consider the effect on the victimized group or victimized individual, something like intimidation or just running away, fleeing?
Yeah,
which changes the entire dynamics.
Right.
If people flee, that there's nobody to the victim group becomes even smaller.
That's what I call the direct harm. So if I speak to all of you about how terrible people in Philadelphia are, and I'm really very, very vicious and effective in this speech, so by the time I'm finished, you feel pretty awful because I've told you all these terrible things. I'm sorry. I'm of course taking a flippant example, and I don't. I mean, I do that because I can't think of another way of drawing you all together as a group. But and of course, I don't want it to be a serious case since I'm talking about you. But I'm using it to illustrate very serious cases. You can frighten, humiliate, even terrorize a person directly with speech, or a group of people. Dangerous speech, as I've described it, since I'm interested in the process that leads to collective violence, uses, by contrast, an indirect pathway. In other words, I would talk to all of you about how awful the people in Baltimore are, with a view to getting you to do terrible things to them. That's genocide, for example. That is indirect in the sense that I talk to one group to turn them against another group so that the harm is carried out by my audience against another group. With cyberbullying, for example, the harm is direct. I'm talking at someone in the hope that that person will be harmed, or even, God forbid, will harm him or herself. Do you see that? So that's another important distinction that so far my dangerous speech framework doesn't encompass, but maybe it will eventually.
In a totally different direction, I'm interested in the Umati project, and I'm going to ask the question that you told us to ask, but how did you search Facebook and how did you search Twitter?
Twitter was easy because it's open and public, and so there are certain hashtags.
You just search hashtags.
Yeah. And in fact, we managed to capture some big data sets of Twitter because you can do that if you go into the API fast enough. I think there's a 2-week window. So Twitter's not complicated. With Facebook, we had teams of monitors from the different ethnic groups in Kenya, the major tribes, because they had the languages and the knowledge to be able to perform the analysis. They also had friends on Facebook, and they made more friends on Facebook, and that's how they monitored Facebook.
But you were tracking the things on public pages, right?
Not only.
Okay.
So they made
So-
friends.
Specifically so that they could monitor their pages.
In some cases, they already had the friends, and in other cases, they friended people whom they knew because of their knowledge of those communities were producing dangerous speech.
How many pages total?
I don't know how many pages they were.
So in terms of measuring, if you were trying to do this in your next phase of research, the having your sample on Twitter or Facebook or something, and then using 5 different types of ways of getting people. How are you going to measure effect online of these prevention methods? Are you only going to measure public recanting of hate speech? Are you going to try to contact the purveyors of hate
It's a great
speech and
question.
ask them if did you have a change of heart because many
Yeah.
times it's not public that
I'd like to do both. First of all, we would look for people whose speech has changed after they receive counter speech messages, and of course that would be better than what we've done so far, in the sense that I'd like to have randomized samples large enough so that they would suggest at least some effect. But then we ought to go back and survey to test those hypotheses. And of course, the survey would be vulnerable to all kinds of weaknesses. You know, how can you trust that someone's response is reliable? But you know, my hope is to do it on a large enough scale so that we could get results that are statistically significant from both methods. And you know, with millions and billions of people on these platforms, that shouldn't be too difficult.
And then will someone be eligible to be, you know, an entrepreneur of hate speech, you know, from one tweet, or do you have to have established history of being that way over time? You know, because like looking for changes of someone, okay, who's reduced hate speech, they're going off one terrible thing they said, and then most of the time they don't say those kind of things anywhere, and counting the wrong thing.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. No, that's a wonderful question, and it brings up my guess that just as we have a typology of dangerous speech, and I hope eventually a typology of counter speech, there are also different kinds of hate speakers. And one of the reasons why I'm guardedly optimistic about this project is that it's a general rule of thumb from social psychology that in a given society, most people are not extremists, right? You can probably get that from your own life experience in any case. A rule of thumb is that between 10 and 20% of people in a society are hardcore, whatever the relevant ideology or set of beliefs is, right? 10 to 20% of people are going to be on the margins. And then you have some majority of people who are in the, let's call it the malleable middle. For example, I told you about the tweets following the selection of the latest Miss America. The guy I mentioned who at first tweeted some really hateful, ugly, vicious content, eventually apologized to Miss America. From what we know about him so far, he was not a member of a hate group or a, you know, Klan member or Stormfront or anything like that. He's a young guy in Georgia. I'd like to know more about him, and I hope that I soon will. But, you know, he was influenced undoubtedly by other people offline and online. But then he was influenced in a different direction and completely changed his tune. So what I'm hoping is that some reasonably sizable proportion of people who are producing offensive and inflammatory content online are malleable, and that we can find ways to influence them online, which, by the way, were impossible for the vast majority of people in the world before online media. So most 16-year-olds in the world are influenced mostly by a relatively small number of people around them who share, roughly speaking, a set of beliefs. Now there is an opportunity. There's another route into those brains all over the world. I don't want to get too Pollyannish on you, but even that possibility didn't exist, 10 years ago. You had a question, I think.
Me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was very inspiring. I was thinking all the time about Syria, which is my research field, and actually, unfortunately, a very timely example of this hate speech and genocide also. So I have a couple of comments related to the Syria situation, which I'm very familiar with, and a couple of questions. So the first one is I was thinking when you mentioned like dehumanizing the audience, or not the audience, but the group that you are
Yes.
accusing through your speech. I was thinking about Bashar al-Assad speeches, you know. It was in fact very clever compared to other Arab leaders that were calling insects or germs, the protesters, you know. He actually, in a very famous speech, I think it was a year ago, he actually decided to call the people who were fleeing the country, so fellow Syrian citizens, like people who don't have the right to be citizens, because it's actually better that they leave the country instead of, you know, staying in a country which they don't love. So actually, he drew a very clear line between those who love the country, who would eventually stay, and those who don't love the country would eventually go. And it means that those who love the country would stay in the country are supporters
Yes.
of his ideology. So this is, I think, a very clever strategy, because instead of accusing the people who flew to be insects of germs, he's actually saying as if, you know,
They're
you
just
deserve
the
to
other,
be-
they're outsiders.
Exactly.
It's another hallmark. The Rohingya in Myanmar, they are foreigners. They're not of us. They are the others. They don't even belong in this country. To take another example from the Ivory Coast, this term ivoirité was invented in 2002, if I'm not mistaken, to describe people from the north of the country. They are not really Ivorians, they are others. They were also described as allogènes. I'm sorry, you hit on one of these other hallmarks, which also I found from case to case to case to case. So yes, al-Assad was ingenious, but unfortunately he's not the only one at all to hit on that
Actually,
trick.
so my question comes to a different context, which is our so-called democratic context, because when you were mentioning the accusation in a mirror, I was thinking that even in a place such as the United States, the way you construct public speeches vis-à-vis terrorism, for example, to justify state violence, it's a form of hate speech. So I wonder what's your take on this? Because yes, there are hate speeches that comes from users and from terrorist groups. There are also hate speeches coming from governments, namely United States and also in Europe. But we have different ways to. I mean, I'm just taking the example since you mentioned the drone thing, because the drone situation is actually justified by the us versus them situation. I mean, they are enemies, and our security and stability is threatened by these people, so we have to act. And this is an hate speech, in my view. Or, I mean, I'm building on what you just said. So this is my first question. The second question is about the media. And in fact, I mean, I have 2 points. One point about the internet and new technology. There is a lot of literature saying that actually new media, especially Twitter and Facebook, they do create information cocoon, which is, you know, I would only listen to people that think like me. And this is pretty much the case, especially on Facebook, okay? So I wonder whether you agree or not with this theory. And the second question about the television, because actually I do see your point about progressive so-called TV fiction, but I have a great example actually. My PhD dissertation is about this kind of soap opera in Syria. So under Bashar al-Assad for 10 years and more, he had actually injected progressive, so-called progressive messages in the public space, especially through this kind of fiction, to discipline people, to tell them how to think about citizenship, religion, you know, every sort of issue. So I wonder who is behind cultural production, because yeah, you can use this thing, but in a situation like Syria, and most of the authoritarian regimes, they actually have an agreement with the elites. They work together. They have a way of thinking. So, you know, I mean, I don't think television could be actually the best way to convey this kind, or it could be, but as in the case of Syria, it looks like an elite cultural production, which is dominated by elite cultural producers and elite political elites against the population.
Tremendously helpful. So, first of all, on the cocoons, I've read the same research, and of course I've experienced it online as well. In fact, I just read a very interesting paper about the circumstances in which people are more or less likely to listen to information with which they disagree. I think it was circulated on the Birth Maniacs list, and so you have seen it. first of all, with more research like that, then we can figure out how to make a little hole in a cocoon. Secondly, and this is a dangerous, I shouldn't use the word dangerous, this is a daring thing to say, but it is possible that the intermediaries themselves, the ICTs, the companies, have a special capacity to reach people in two ways. Number one, with the architecture of their platforms. Very little work has been done other than by the companies in order to make more money, to study the effects of the architecture of the platforms on human belief and behavior. But there have been already some interesting experiments done, for example, by Facebook, on getting users to behave in a more civil way. And they have, again, for their business purposes, they've had some quite striking success. So that's one possibility. The second is huge numbers of people, in spite of themselves, seem to care what Facebook and Twitter think. They certainly care what Facebook and Twitter do. For example, if Facebook has made even the smallest change to the settings, then people all over the world in any number of varied normative communities are aware of that and react to it and discuss it. So there, I think, are some possibilities there.
I think we probably have to go, but I want to.
And then a second, I'm sorry.
Are you done?
I think you had a second question.
Well, no, the first question was about the hate speech initiated by states, actually. So
Oh, yes, of
what about-
course. Yeah, thank you. That's right. So, genocide is almost always either initiated by states or endorsed by states. So even the strongest and most inflammatory and dangerous and powerful speech is typically state endorsed.
Yeah, sorry, I'm talking about the so-called democracies.
Yeah,
The West.
I know you are. I'm getting
Yeah.
there. I'm trying to avoid it, but I'm going.
No, but actually that's, I think, more interesting than just talking about Rwanda or Syria.
Of course. Somebody at Bernard Schlink actually asked me a couple of years ago, can there be hate speech in war? Because after all, states are forever using speech to condition civilian populations to tolerate and to take part in war. And what I said is that propaganda for war is different from incitement to genocide, because war is not the same as genocide. So if the state is using speech to get a civilian population to accept war crimes or genocide, that is different from getting the civilian population to tolerate war.
This is kind of tricky because I would say that Bashar al-Assad is doing the same. Yeah. So, although I'm pretty sure he's doing a genocide in his country, but if we just analyze his speeches and Obama's speeches, I'm sorry to touch such a nice guy. I mean, actually, but you know, the way, you know, or we can take Bush as an example.
I'm happy to take Bush.
I mean, but yeah, maybe it's better, you know, because Obama is such a nice guy, so you don't want to touch him. And he's black, so of course, but I mean, in a way, you know, if we just analyze, we do a textual analysis of what they are saying, and that would, are they justifying, you know, an attack on Afghanistan, or Bush was justifying an attack on Iraq in 2003. It's exactly the way
it is. Very often they use the
and
same
that's why
techniques.
I said he's clever, because
Yes.
I think he's taking our neoliberal way of framing the things and using it in another context.
Some of
And
these,
so
though,
in this way, we need to justify it.
yeah, but
Because
also,
if we justify Obama and Bush, then we just justify.
but here's the thing, that's why you need a contextual analysis. Some of these techniques, and what I'm calling hallmarks, are ancient rhetorical methods identified by Aristotle. One of the questions that the Umati monitors asked often was, Professor, where is the line between political speech and dangerous speech? And what I had to tell them is that there's very often an overlap, because any politician, almost without exception, speaks to his or her own group in a way that exalts that group and the politician and his or her ideas and denigrates the other set. So that is automatically otherizing, group distinguishing language,
We're
and
gonna
uses many of the same
continue.
techniques.
Continue. informally.
Continue after. Okay. Anybody else? A question for everyone?
Just to clarify one thing, we started with a discussion of, I guess, the state or governmental paradigms and approaches to hate speech, and then moved from that into this conception of dangerous speech as a framework for, more civic education type applications. Is your framework of dangerous speech intended to have any sort of legal applications?
Thank you. It's a very good question. I started trying to define incitement to genocide in a more useful, reliable way for international criminal law, in which there is this very new and rapidly growing body of speech law, focused principally on the crime of incitement to genocide, and also to some extent on hate speech of all things, as an element of crimes against humanity. I was reading the jurisprudence of the Rwanda War Crimes Tribunal and becoming alarmed that, in my view, it conflates hate speech and incitement to genocide. Since incitement is an inchoate crime, now I'm getting a little legal on you, but incitement to genocide is very closely, obviously, linked to genocide, which is widely considered the worst crime ever codified. Hate speech can't possibly be in that category, and so I thought it was tremendously important to draw a line between them. And that was the very beginning of my work on all of this. In part because I'm not convinced that prosecution is a very effective tool, I'm now much more interested in other methods to try to diminish the impact of such speech. But I'm still a lawyer and I can't help but think about the law. I don't know if that was a useful answer.
Yes, it just throughout this talk, I've noticed that there are a lot of questions left unanswered in terms of the responsibilities of governments when approaching this kind of speech, or the responsibilities of institutions, ICTs, all that, who is questions of legal as well as moral culpability, and especially when you take into account the social historical context, are the lines really any more clear when we're using this narrower concept of dangerous speech than they are if we're using the broader concept of hate speech? Especially when you consider that dangerous speech narrowing in that way leaves out questions of indirect harms that you mentioned. Fear speech, for instance, silencing effects. There are a lot of questions that would be left unanswered from a legal standpoint.
Do you mean if you tried to criminalize dangerous speech?
Or use that framework to change our conception of hate speech, which it sounded like that was like you said, the impetus for the start of the project.
But I'm not trying to change the conception of hate speech. I'm trying to define another category, leaving hate speech alone. Many countries, perhaps most countries in the world, do regulate hate speech and much broader categories than dangerous speech. Holocaust denial, just to take one example, is criminalized in many countries. In most of the circumstances, in most of the cases I can think of in which people have been prosecuted for Holocaust denial, that speech was not dangerous. And yet there are laws on the books in many countries criminalizing that for other reasons, for reasons other than that speech is likely to catalyze violence. I'm not suggesting that those laws be abolished. I'm just saying that my particular interest is in another category of speech for specific reasons. There are all sorts of categories of speech that we might be worried about or even try to criminalize for other reasons. I haven't mentioned child pornography. I'm not for a second saying that shouldn't be regulated. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I don't mean to suggest that this will cover everything, only that it's an attempt to to find a better way of defining and also a better way of controlling the effects of one subset of bad speech.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks a lot.